Okay, I guess we can get started. A warm welcome to all of you still here with us in the room. A very, very welcome to our protagonists of tonight's roundtable here in the room. Anita with me and Daniel, Donatella and Shelley online. I will come to you in a second, but of course also a warm welcome to all others that are with us remotely, and maybe there are some more joining us as we all know, in times of Zoom meetings and video conferences, we all tend to be a bit late, as I also realized now starting to teach again on site. Perfect. So I'm very excited about this concluding roundtable of this two-day workshop on contentious interactions, as we called it, frontiers in protest research, where we really try to look at how kind of the emergence of new cleavages and lines of conflicts has kind of not only reshaped party competition and the coordinates of politics in Europe and beyond, but also left its traces in protest politics. Protest politics in kind of a twofold meaning, on the one hand in terms of the issues and kind of claims that are contested out there and that are really brought to the forefront of political conflict, so about controversy, but also about kind of the forms of contestation. And kind of the claim that we kind of had here is that maybe it's not something new under the sun that we see interactions across arenas or hybrid political actors and also individuals that do so many things, just because we in political sociology and political science sometimes try to split the world. People might not do that. But I think it's not the claim that this is something new, but that in moments of transformation and rupture, sometimes these dynamics might really have very strong consequences on the future of politics and potentially also democracy at large. And that's kind of what we try to conclude today. I mean, Hans-Peter had before already the job of kind of commenting on three very diverse papers. And I think that was really the ambition of this workshop, to bring people together from very different strands and scholarly fields here and to have a conversation. Of course, that demands from all of us quite some intellectual flexibility and I guess also curiosity. And I think also the roundtable tonight shows kind of our intellectual curiosity to bring together people that might work on very similar topics, but maybe don't have at least daily conversations with each other. And now I'm just looking at the big screen that I can see here, and we lost the face with Donatella. So I guess we have to wait a little, but I would say I already start with introducing the protagonists of tonight, and then we hopefully have Donatella with us in a second again. The first one I would like to welcome is Shelley Boulianne, a leading expert in the study of citizens' engagement with a particular focus, as we have also heard before, on how social media and digital tools more generally transform participation and kind of impact on participation. Shelley is associate professor at MacEwan University in Edmonton. And I mean, she has also, as all the scholars we have tonight, published a whole lot. So I just recommend maybe one of her latest articles that she published last year in Communication Research that looked back at 20 years of digital media effects on civic and political participation. And I think that 20 years already tells us something, that this is not so new and we should not always treat it as if this is something so brand new. The next one I wanted to introduce in alphabetical order is Donatella, but I will skip that maybe for a moment and already come to Anita Godes, who is luckily with me here in this beautiful room at the WZB. Anita is a specialist on political violence and contentious politics, also with a particular focus on digital tools and the cyberspace more generally. Currently, she's also professor of international and cybersecurity here in Berlin at the Hertie School. And one of her latest publications I would also like to recommend, just published last year in the American Journal of Political Science, focuses on states' control of the internet and how that affects also states' kind of use of violent repression. So Luckily, Donatella is back with us, so she's next in this round of warm welcomes. Donatella is one of the most renowned scholars of social movements and political violence that we have these days. Donatella is currently Professor of Political Science and Dean of the Faculty of Political Science and Sociology at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence. There she also directs the Center on Social Movement Studies Cosmos. And we're also super happy that Donatella is also a research fellow or fellow with us here at the Center for Civil Society Research. And just in a week's time, she will also be with us for much longer here in Berlin. I mean, with Donatella, I cannot start with the list of publications, so I will also just leave it with one. And her latest, or one of the latest books, was called Can Social Movements Save Democracy?, published with Polity Press last year. And then finally, I have the pleasure to introduce Daniel Sieblatt. What did I write on Daniel? On my nice notes here that I now already made here. Finally, we also have with us Daniel Sieblatt, a specialist on the history of democracy, and he is currently Eaton Professor of Government at Harvard University and also Director of the Research Unit on Transformations of Democracy here at the WZB. I mean, you all know probably and have read also his book on how democracies die that had such an influence on the discipline, but also on public debate more broadly. I would recommend maybe also taking a look at one of his latest working papers co-authored with Hanno Hilbig and Daniel Bischoff on the wealth of tongues, why peripheral regions vote for the radical right in Germany. So to all of you, again, a warm welcome here. As you have seen, we really have a diverse set of scholars spanning many subfields in our disciplines. And we agreed on the following kind of, not the cast you have here, but on the kind of flow of affairs. We agreed that first I have kind of two sets of warm-up questions. The first set is really warm-up, just to get us talking. And then you have about 5 minutes max to kind of give us already some first impression. Then we have a second set of questions that I will ask you that are a bit more tricky, where we really want to know from you kind of where you would push us in this field of study and what you think are kind of blind spots here. And then, of course, we also have ample room for conversations among the panelists, but also, of course, for your questions. So please don't be shy, just post them in the Q&A function that you have in the webinar. And of course, the people in here, you would need to still raise your hand in a very old-fashioned way, and Sophia hopefully has a pen there and will also take note of who would like to say something here. Okay, perfect. But then let me start with the warm-up questions, and I thought we would maybe start with Donatella and then kind of take turns. And the first question was kind of, more simple. I just wanted them, when they hear the term protest, what kind of images or associations really come to your mind first, as a citizen or as a scholar? And second, maybe also tell us a bit more how and why actually protest enters the picture in your field of research or approach, if it does at all. So Donatella, yes. I know this is a tough one for you, but it's 5 minutes.
Thank you, Sven. And I start by saying that today is my last day as Dean, so that I will be even more glad to come to Berlin without this burden. It has been nice, but now it's nice that it is over. And of course, the questions of how protest entered my field of studies is very central in social movement studies. Protest is considered to be almost synonymous for what we study. I'm going to say it is not really true that it is the only actions that social movements do, but of course, protest has been always considered as the main modalities of expressions of social movements. And in the past, research has suggested that protest was the resource of the powerless. Cela dit, I think also that what we have noticed in our research is that types of protests tend to change, for instance, in terms of degree of disruptiveness. And so also the images changes. So if we think about the very first images of protest with the French revolutions, it was the barricades. And in fact, there have been studies devoted to this. But then with what Shelley defined as the development of the modern repertoires of actions, protests tended to become more still an expressions of massive presence, but with less disruptions involved in them. And the march has been for a long time quite the very main image of a social movement, so marching in the street. I think, though, that different social movements have been characterized by different forms of actions and then also by different images. So that's, if we look at covers of books on social movements, we moved already in the beginning of this millennium from the images of citizens marching in the streets, the fourth states and so on, to the images of, for instance, social forums, which implied people sitting around and talking a lot. So more meetings and exchange of ideas. And also if we look at the covers of books that address the anti-austerity protest, in which Southern Europe has been very relevant in the imaginary, at least of the social movement scholarship, very often the image is a square where people sit around and also try to develop knowledge, discuss, exchange ideas. So the type of images also points at some transformations in the very meaning that protest has for the actors. If we look at 2019, the massive protest that preceded the lockdown phase, what we see is a lot of blockades, so a return of direct actions. For instance, I'm just returning from Barcelona. The airport in Barcelona had been blocked in 2019. There were massive protests with blockade in Chile, in Lebanon, in Hong Kong, and so on. So the images changes. And to close, I think that what is remain in common is that we think especially about actions in the open space. So also protests as reconquering a public space. That address at the same time different actors. So it is not just striking and staying at home, but it is also marching in order to try to make the protest visible and sensitizing different actors. And I think, last point, but we can develop this later on, I think all these types of actions seems to be chosen in a strategic way, but keeping in mind sort of normative concerns. So sitting in the squares, for instance, was very much related with the idea that those social movements ahead of democracy, of the policy of reconquering public spaces and so on. I think my 5 minutes are off.
It's 4:30. I'm taking time.
Okay.
It was all very good.
I keep the 30 for the next.
And I would like to hand over maybe to Shelley to next compliment, and then just that you know, and it's not always a guest, then I would come to Anita and maybe have Daniel last.
Thank you. And thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this roundtable. I'm really honored. In terms of images, I would have to say, of course, now I am primed to think about violent protests, given the last two presentations we had. But I didn't want to talk about violence and protest. I think that is actually just a small subset of protest activities, and certainly one that garners a lot of attention, both on social media, but as well as news media. And so thinking about this through the lens of how I study protest, I know that a lot of people, their first encounters with a protest event would be through coverage of news media. And we know that there's biases in how the news media cover protest events. They gravitate towards these, angry expressions or these dramatic illustrations, but they definitely cultivate this idea that protest events are places of high emotion, a lot of aggression, and a lot of anger. And so this is one of the things that I've been trying to tackle with my research, is saying, really, is that really how we should be conceptualizing protest events, as these angry mobs of people that we've seen a historical literature on that as well. And so I'm looking at the roles of emotions as opposed to the roles of other factors, such as people's social capital or their network ties and that sort of thing. And maybe we don't need so much focus on this idea of the angry protester, and maybe we should have a different image that comes to the forefront of news media or even social media when it comes to protesters. And that was only 2 minutes, sorry.
That's no problem. Anita, if you would like to compliment.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm also very honored to be part of this panel. I've also learned a lot throughout the day today, specifically different viewpoints on protest. So because I study political violence and mostly focus on state repression, when I think of protesters, the first thing I think of is courage, not angry mobs, but kind of courage. Because in most of the contexts I study protesters are confronting a political status quo by taking to the streets. And that oftentimes takes immense courage. So precisely knowing that turning out can have massively adverse consequences and possible repercussions such as repression, I think means that, that in these contexts, being a protester is being courageous. So I study state behavior both online and offline, and one of the core assumptions that I share with a lot of repression researchers is that repression is instrumental. So that means it's used as a tool to achieve some kind of goal, and that goal usually is raising the costs of challenging the political and social order. And so I think that has a big effect on how states use repression specifically against protesters. When I think about when states use repression, one of the core things we know is that they will use repression against perceived threats, perceived challenges, and oftentimes protesters are those perceived challenges. I think a key innovation in the recent research on protest repression is that modern day repressive states, autocrats, sometimes democrats, are less likely to just full on shut down protests and are more likely to think about protests as phenomena that need to be managed and not phenomena that need to be shut down. And so I think that is really a kind of a shift that we're seeing in terms of the methods that are used to confront protesters from the state side. So protesters are not just presenting a threat, they're also providing information on possible asymmetries between what the state is doing and then what non-state actors might want. And so I think that information is becoming increasingly important for state actors. And so when we look at how protesters are confronted by the state, we see them using the kind of conventional forms of coercion, violence, and that includes, I think, restrictive forms of internet access. But we also see them using increasing forms of online propaganda, pushing certain forms of information narratives, framing the discourse. And then lastly, and I think I'd like to talk about that more later, the use of monitoring software, infiltration, and increasingly using data to forecast protester behavior. And so I think those are kind of the ways in which protesters kind of come into my research.
Yeah. Perfect. And I think this was already a nice bridge that we kind of started with the social movements and kind of the the historically changing action repertoires went to kind of the people that also just observe, at least at first sight, and kind of now moved on kind of also to another, of course, very important party in the whole kind of interaction, being the state and the repressive apparatus more specifically. And now I'm wondering where Daniel kind of shoots at.
Yeah, so thank you, Sven. It's really nice to be on this panel. And I do have, you know, when one's an outsider to a field, that one runs the risk, maybe I can say something fresh and new. I run the risk of being a trespasser, or even worst of all, of being totally irrelevant. So hopefully not the last point. But I don't directly work in this field, but I mean, I really appreciate participating, because, you know, I'm somebody who studies institutional change, formal institutional change. You know, when we think of democratization as being a variety of informal institutional change, how institutions of the state change. And, you know, when I think about how people in my field treat protest, in some ways, it's almost like the kind of prime mover or unmoved mover of politics, in that it's that all of our theories of institutional change, no matter what we think drives it, ultimately rely on some model that there's groups in society that are mobilizing, often through protests. And so if one thinks of all the various theories of democratization that are out there that require an assumption of what's, you know, put in quotation marks, a threat of revolution, which is a very loose term that people use that essentially means disorderly conduct in the streets that's not through formal channels. And that all of our theories of institutional change rely upon that without really investigating it sufficiently. So, you know, what I think of when I think of protest is, you know, I think of historical periods. I think of the swing riots of the 1830s, efforts to sabotage machines by agricultural workers and protests in the countryside that supposedly led to the first Reform Act, or the revolts of the field, agricultural workers in the 1880s who were protesting having their land taken away from them, that ultimately led to the third Reform Act that democratized Britain. So I think, so in that sense, I think of the consequences of these sorts of protest historically. But then there's a second side to the story, and this I think gets at the whole ambiguity of or sort of one of the core theoretical questions about the study of protest and social movements, is that, you know, when I think about the contemporary era, or I think about the 1920s, 1930s, moving up through the contemporary era, the way I often conceptualize things is that protest movements are often, and this is clearly part of the social movements literature as well, are often the unintended result of failed mobilization strategies of political elites. So political leaders talk about certain issues, and we've seen some panels, some of the papers today in this conference talking about this, that political leaders may, in fact, you know, try to mobilize voters along certain issues, informed by activists who tell them what issues to mobilize along. And in the process, they may mobilize publics who begin to be dissatisfied, and politicians often lose control of this. And so, you know, I think of the Tea Party movement in the United States as being in part this. It's a, you know, bottom-up thing. I mean, there's two streams in politics: a bottom-up, bubbling up dissatisfaction, but on the other hand, I sort of regard the Tea Party, for instance, in the United States, as the long-run result of a failed Republican strategy over 30 years to activate voters along a set of issues for which they never delivered to their voters. And so then ultimately you get a kind of protest movement. And so when I think about protest, I often think about it, that, you know, that the degree to which it's stage managed, which maybe isn't quite the right word, because that suggests, you know, complete control. It's sort of, you know, like, you know, a parent setting up a birthday party for their child, and then the birthday party doesn't go according to plan, and you get kind of chaos in result. And so I sort of think of the way that politics in a top-down way interacts with these bottom-up movements. And so that's how I think about it. So in a sense, it's interesting that I think that the literature that I rely upon and think about requires an exogenous protest movement that's coming up from below, whereas in reality, I think I know. And when we think about the contemporary world, the way the world we know better, we see the degree to which it's a two-way street. So maybe I'll stop there.
Okay, perfect. Thanks a lot. This was already a big thesis, I have to say, and I'm not sure if the others would already like to kind of respond, or if we should get back to this later. Maybe we can do that later, but because I'm really tempted to kind of reply on kind of what comes first and how we maybe can also disentangle all of that. But as I said before, this was kind of the warm-up that they all kind of are warming up their voices, and we heard them already talk. But now I think, because maybe also online there might be also many kind of younger scholars entering this field, and I think it would really be helpful, because we want to talk about frontiers in research here, and we've already covered quite some ground. If you could really say where you see kind of blind spots in protest research, or if we talk about this frontier metaphor, kind of which of these frontiers you would really move further east or west, south or north, whatever direction you want to go. And I think what would be most important maybe is really the question, I should get closer, is really the question of where would you start building bridges, also in terms of different disciplines, or also in terms of subfields within disciplines. And I think that's why you four are also here. Maybe you already see some bridges in this virtual or proper room here. And I don't have a proper order. If someone really wants to go first, he or she should just signal. Otherwise, I thought Anita, because she has the pleasure to be with us here in Berlin, would be maybe the first one to go. And then the others, maybe if you see already something you want to take up from Anita, then we just see a bit where the flow of the discussion takes us.
Great, thank you. So to make my positionality clear, of course, I'm coming from political science, and so the blind spots I'm seeing, I'm looking for in my own field more than anywhere else. And I wouldn't call them blind spots, but I do think that specifically thinking about technology and the rapid development of technology, I think there's just much more research needed to fully understand the way in which technology is kind of influencing these state-society relationships. And some of the research from 15, 20 years ago, looking at for example, digitally enabled protests and the way in which states are then kind of counter-mobilizing through online spaces, might not be giving us the same results as current day research would be, partly because the thing we're studying, the internet, has changed so much. And so I think one call is to kind of continuously think about the way in which these theories and these insights might be changing. But specifically, the question that kind of keeps me up at night is what we might be summarized as protest management technology. And I think we're seeing a huge increase in investment in protest management technology. We're seeing a lot of the technology that was initially developed and heavily invested in from kind of counterterrorism being redeployed in the context of protest movements. Frankly, we just don't have a lot of good studies telling us how this technology is changing both the dynamics of protests, the probability of onset, but then also the success rate of protests. And so I think that's really, really important. Specifically, I think we have a problem studying the role of surveillance and the role of monitoring technology, because it's something that is difficult for us to observe. And so we don't actually know at this point how many protests didn't materialize because of infiltration, because of our surveillance technology having an effect. We don't know to what extent covert operations sabotage protest movements. And so I think we can learn a lot from other research looking at covert actions, specifically state actions, and see how that might help us understand. We can work with computer scientists. I think computer scientists are really at the forefront of explaining to us how this technology works and what the capabilities are. And lastly, and today again, we heard about the importance of the transnational dimension of protest movements and the way in which Nicole was talking in her paper, the way in which there's linkages between the US and Europe and so on. But we still don't have enough research looking at the transnational dimension of state responses and the way in which states learn from each other. There is some research specifically around the Arab Spring, but I think there's still much more for us to learn in terms of states cooperating with each other.
Many thanks. Is
I'll
there anyone?
I'll say something. Yes,
Okay.
just jump in here. Yeah, so this wasn't going to be a point that I was going to make ahead of time as I thought about what I was going to say, but it's based actually on the conversation, which maybe is a good thing, right? So I think, it makes the last comments from Anita make me think that there is a difference between studying social movements and protests in authoritarian regimes and in democracies. And I guess I'm, given my biases of what I study, I tend to think of studying these in democracy, at least in the contemporary era in democracies. And so I'm often thinking about the way in which electoral strategies of politicians, how politicians talk affect what kind of protests take place. And mobilizational strategies, election, what, again, as I said before, emphasizing certain themes. And I just, I wonder to what degree, these fields, clearly there's some overlap that the strategies, technologies of mobilization are probably similar, no matter what kind of regime one is in. But I wonder to what degree the kind of scope conditions are so different that can one actually build, can one study this acontextually, or can one build theories of mobilization that cut across regime type? So I guess that's maybe a question for those who are more expert in this topic.
Well, if should I intervene then? Because I tried to do that. I tried to analyze and do research on social movement in democratization and in the different steps. And I think that's what is common in the approach is to consider social movements as mobilizing on issues that are emerging in the political system. So not that the leaders, political leaders start this, but I see them more both in authoritarian regimes and in democratic regimes as actively pushing for some issues that are not covered within normal politics. And in the ways in which I've worked, what I saw is that it is helpful and very stimulating bridging social movement studies with other fields, but also in this way considering the advantages of looking at what is starting from below. In the book that Sven mentioned, what I tried to do was to use research on parties, on referendums, and on constitutional processes, looking at what happens when these processes that sometimes do not involve social movements, but are instead actively participated by social movements and often triggered by social movements. So from the Green parties to the socialist parties before, nowadays this return of political parties on the left, what we see is the active capacity of citizens to intervene. And when I thought about the questions that Sven asked us to address in terms of which blind spots, or which type of new frontiers we can look at, I thought my main line of thinking would be broadening conceptions of protest in order to understand various ways in which citizens participate through grassroots forms. So I have to say that probably this is not just wishful thinking about what we can do, because I had a news today, very positive one, that I think will imply also that I will be able to develop some of these ideas in Berlin. And what I think is also dovetailing well, resonating well with the work that the Zentrum for Zivilgesellschaftsforschung is doing, is to focus more attentions on the characteristics of important protest events. So not just to consider events as aggregates, but more looking also through ethnographic forms or process tracing to the ways in which some particular events in history have been able to trigger changes. So in the line of research of Doug McAdam, but also of historians, to look at the capacity of events to transform structures. And this implies also to look at how protest is concretely organized in relational ways, how interactions happen with different actors, because it is not the case that social movement activists are just in the street, are just at the gate, to use the metaphor of Sidney Tarrow. But often they enter institutions through different forms. And more this happens in a moment in which institutions seems to be particularly unstable, going from one crisis to the next. So this type of reversal also of the causal order, looking at protest as not just facilitated or permitted by transformations at the institutional level, but also looking at how the protests create opportunities and resources, which I think is particularly relevant in democratization processes, but we see it is more relevant also nowadays. And the sort of lessons that I drew from research on progressive social movements in the pandemic is that we often focus too much the attentions on what is done in the streets or in the squares, while many forms of protest take other type of modalities of intervention. So in particular, I think it is important also to consider how for social movements, knowledge building is also an expression and the form of protesting through the transformations of visions, through suggestions about what can be done in order to produce changes in the environment. And the other things that I saw happening a lot during the pandemic, and I think we should study more and could also contribute to bridging civil society literature with social movement literatures, is the multiplications of actions of self-help, mutual help, solidarity initiatives that during the pandemics, at least in the countries I started to study, have also represented sort of arenas in which different actors have met, and so also helped producing different types of coalitions between actors that traditionally were used to be considered by different parts of the social sciences and the political sciences.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Donatella and Shelley.
Thank you. I want to return to the point that Anita had raised about digital media. So this is basically my entry point to this literature that I'm going to talk about today. I have done studies about the role of digital media in mobilizing citizens' engagement. And that means electoral participation. It means participation in marches and demonstration. It means participation in boycotting and volunteering in all sorts of civic activities. My background is, in fact, in sociology. I'm trained as a sociologist. Although I actually am very happy to say that I wear many hats and I'm accepted in many circles. In particular, a lot of people think I'm a political scientist because I'm heavily involved in the American Political Science Association. And then communication scholars, of course, consider me as well as one of their own because of my focus on digital media and news media and social media. And these are things that the field of communication really has a strong hold on. Anyways, you mentioned the article that I published that was about the role of digital media in political participation. So after studying 300 studies and figuring out what was going on in that big picture across different countries, across different forms of participation, I wanted to return to my sociology roots and understand how digital media impacts boycotting, and I've already published that paper that is a summary of the literature. And now I'm working on the question of protest participation. So in particular, marches and demonstrations. So what I've done is I've gathered studies, I do meta-analysis, I've gathered over 100 studies that use surveys to understand who participates and who doesn't participate in marches and demonstrations. And I wanted to understand if digital media is one of the more important factors, or is it one of many factors that could predict participation in protests? And I'll just give you, because I'm literally working on this right now, there's like hundreds and hundreds of pages of regression tables that I'm trying to sort through. But here's my story that I will tell at this point in time. Digital media is definitely an overlooked factor and a strong factor in terms of predicting whether or not people participate in marches and demonstrations. We see lots of consistent effects about the role of education and ideology and group membership, so organizational ties, social ties that sociologists would study. But those are sort of the four big factors that predict whether or not people participate in marches and demonstrations. What I don't see as a big factor are things like discontent, distrust, anger, dissatisfaction with the economy, dissatisfaction with democracy. So this is actually quite interesting, and I'm still writing up my findings, but it's where I think we have spent so much time as sociologists trying to understand grievances and this emotions, negative emotions motivating protests, that I think we have to step back and say, there's other things that we need to be considering. We need to be considering social ties, and we definitely need to be considering digital media as not an extension of news media, but as a distinct media that has its own influences. So again, tying into what Anita has said. Thank you.
Sven, could I jump in? Because I realized I kind of asked a question rather than making a point on this. Yeah, so I mean, it seemed, one thought I had while listening to the conversation this afternoon, and in particular, Sebastian gave his presentation and Rashan Maxwell gave us some interesting kind of methodological points. So this is more a kind of methodological point, which is that, you know, that the increasingly rigorous, I would say, standards of causal inference require particular kinds of research designs, it seems like, among scholars, which is to look either at, you know, some break points, or, you know, as Rashan was suggesting to Sebastian, I think quite correctly, to kind of do a difference in difference kind of strategy, which require a kind of narrow, and if one thinks of experiments as well, social survey experiments require a very narrow kind of temporal scope. So that is, one looks at whether protest leads to radical right voting, or radical right voting leads to protest. And you have to come up with a research design that is sort of a very neat design that allows one to look at, you know, from point A to point B in sort of short time frame, what is the effect? Now that, you know, this is all great and so on, but I think the concern I have is that, you know, what if, and this is a more general point in the study of politics and society, which is, what if causes develop over long periods of time, you know? And so what if the kind of a cause happens 30, 40 years ago and it slowly accumulates? So to take the Tea Party example again, you know, what if the Tea Party mobilization, you know, during the Obama presidency was the result of 30 years of accumulated grievances that only come to the fore at a particular moment? And so when one tries to explain what is happening, you kind of have to come up with the standards that we've now set for ourselves as disciplines often narrow our scope to such a degree that we can't actually look at the thing that's sort of the elephant in the room, the obvious thing that's happening, which is this long run process. And so, and if one tries to make an argument about a long run process, then there's going to be a kind of critique, well, you know, how do we know this is really happening? You're just sort of asserting this is just sort of correlational or whatever. So I'm not quite sure how we get out of this bind where our own evidentiary standards in a way have tied our hands so that we can't in some way make a convincing case for things that might actually really matter. And so I don't know kind of what the solution to that is.
I think that's an important problem, because I was also thinking throughout this workshop, we had kind of also yesterday afternoon with Susan Staggenberg and others, always these kind of, what kind of leads to persistency of these structures. And as Donatella said, also this persistency is often in very invisible forms of action that are really beyond kind of the public's eyes, at least at large. And I think one kind of way the field is taking is also getting closer to that and trying to get closer at the universe of that, kind of trying to get maybe at social media samples and get them kind of in action over time. But at the same time, as you rightly say, that is somehow in conflict with a very kind of neat causal design that looks for some kind of rupture often. I mean, we had Stefano Bartolini, Andre likes to quote him saying, well, but if we all now do causal inference, we all have to wait for the next earthquake somehow. And I'm just trying to push you a bit, because I was just wondering, because what you, Donatella, said in broadening kind of the scope of what we actually understand with the term protest, but also in kind of building these bridges with civil society research more broadly, but also maybe then coming kind of to you that mentioned kind of the digital politics and how it evolves and this management. How do you personally kind of maybe deal with these tension between kind of the identification of the proper kind of causal effects and what might drive history in these crucial moments, and the more long-term kind of evolution that might just be as important that Daniel said? I mean, this is a big question for all of us, but maybe if you could just bring it back to kind of what you said before about where we should be heading in terms of studying. And Donatella, if you would maybe like to go first.
Well, they are relevant questions, and I think they also address methodological pluralism in the way in which we want to study a phenomenon. Taking the metaphor of the earthquake, I would say we are quite near to that, because we are having a lot of crises one after the other, and so very important critical junctures that could help us understanding how a phenomenon evolves. When thinking about especially the research on social movements in the pandemic, my impression is that also cross-national analysis in the traditional way would be very useful in order to understand more in depth what is innovative related to global transformations, and but also how global and shared transformations are embedded in different institutions. And I think that in this sense, we are almost living within a big experiment in which we have a dramatic change, and we can see how this had an impact on different institutional traditions, but also different social movement traditions. So for instance, when thinking about self-help, new mutualism, civil society organizations, is one of the topics I want to develop also when I come and stay with you. But I think that there are the different ways in which Southern Europe deals with interventions by the citizens in the areas of services and so on, and in which countries that have been more considered as more near to a neo-corporatist type of relationship intervene. I think it's already visible that there are these types of differences, and so that this could also affect the ways in which a common trigger produces different changes. I've started to see also some comparative analysis, for instance, in Latin America, an analysis, a comparison of Argentina and Brazil. I want to develop this comparison between Italy and Germany, and I think that this is something important in order to understand these interactions between institutions and change.
Thank you. So the comparativist kind of speaking. Maybe Anita, or if you would like kind of to add how you deal with this tension and how you would probably also deal with it when you go for the research topic you just mentioned, the management of protest.
I think it's notoriously unsatisfying to study events that, in a sense, actors have an incentive to cover up, and I think this is the bane of my research life, trying to uncover largely either illegal or otherwise unwanted activities. And so I think this is a huge problem. And I think Razan said something important earlier in the discussion, namely, these are issues we do not want to randomize or have some kind of, effect on ourselves as researchers. So we have to study them observationally to a certain extent. And that is unsatisfying. But I think specifically in the area, and I think that's why also the work that Shelley is doing is so great in actually trying to bring together all the existing research that we have, is really fantastic, and actually bringing together various strands of research to actually theorize about a lot of these issues, because I think we still require a lot of theorizing specifically about the role of less visible forms of state control. So I think theorizing. The second is description, specifically in the area of quantitative research and big data research. I feel like there is a renewed appreciation for quantitative description. So there's a new journal, the Journal of Quantitative Description, that I think is fantastic. It's saying we're not going to be publishing causal claims, because oftentimes we don't know what the actual patterns look like, and that can actually help us kind of move forward. So I think description, theorizing, are maybe two ways to kind of get at some of these issues. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I jump in on that point as well? So yes, I would like to, of course, promote the journal as well. I'm on the editorial board, and I think it's wonderful that there is a journal out there that's interested in descriptive research. There's something else that I see going on in the scholarship, in particular around digital media, that seems to be replicating something that was done early on in sociology as well, which is this case study approach, which, ends up with a good deal of research on a particular case without trying to understand the context or whether or not it applies beyond that case. So for example, of course, for many social movement scholars, the civil rights movement is going to inform, how they do their research design, but they study another case of a particular movement or another movement. So the climate strike is another movement that seems to be like, there's a lot of research on the climate strike movement, and I'm contributing to some of it, but it's always studying one particular movement. So using digital trace data or social media trace data, we have a paper with 3 million tweets on the climate strike over the 2-year time period, or 18 months. But they're developing this narrative around a particular case without considering broader processes. So I just like, and again, repeating what the other panelists have said, I think there needs to be more discussion about how does this apply to other movements, rather than just trying to understand a single movement in isolation. And we need those comparative studies. So the climate strike versus, what other movements could be used to compare and to develop a theory that would apply across these different case studies.
Thank you very much. I think that points a bit that maybe also in the field of protest and social movements, we have a whole lot of information these days. So oftentimes, you said kind of the other side is maybe more problematic, but on the movement itself, but there are still these hidden facets that maybe are harder to uncover, and especially in kind of a more causal and even thick description is kind of sometimes difficult. But I would like now to let the four of you also think a bit, what have I already heard from the other four that really made me now rethink kind of my initial thoughts for this panel, but also you all in here in the room, because this is kind of also your conversation, and also in the chat, please use the Q&A function, and Sophia Hunger is sitting here at the table. She will also read a bit what is in there and try to kind of also read out your comments and questions, so that you can use kind of the energy that we have here and the brain power that is in this round table. So I'm looking into the room. Who has kind of already some thoughts or wants to steer this conversation in a different direction? Now is the time. Michael Heaney, please.
Hi, thank you very much. I really enjoyed this roundtable so far, at least. One of the things that impressed me about the conference the past 2 days is that there's a fair amount of work that's being done by the scholars here on right-wing social movements. And, you know, it's been an observation of mine, and I'm sure many people here, that that's an area that has been neglected, that social movement scholars have tended to really lean on looking at right or progressive left social movements. And so it just struck me that it's great to see that, that movement, and that might be something that we might want to think more about, you know, like how we might use what kind of different approaches come to be relevant for right-wing social movements. I think of the work of, for example, Kathleen Blee's done fantastic work where she actually goes and, you know, God bless her soul, meets these people and interviews them closely. But I think this is something that's worth more exploration and discussion.
Maybe I can put this in a question also, because we struggled a bit, of course, with the comparison, because then we had Nicole Dürr talking about kind of how now the far right kind of also is a transnational translator. And the first question is, of course, how does this differ to the left? But maybe also in your field of research, how much can we still kind of use the same concepts developed kind of, as Shelley said, maybe from a historical period or a certain movement, or is does kind of this looking at the far right and movements beyond kind of progressive movements, how much has it challenged you? Does one of you or two maybe want to react to this?
Well, I've studied right-wing movements in the past, and I think that some of the concepts developed in social movement studies work also for them, because I think that it was useful for our understanding in a comparative analysis we made of Italy, United States, and Germany, on the radical right about 10 years ago. Was useful to consider, first of all, that the radical right is not just violent actions. So to see also at the ways in which they try to build consensus. It was useful to see the networks type of organizational structures that they also developed, because very often previous research had looked at just some radical right organizations, tendentially in a more traditional way, so more looking at the leadership or more looking at the ideologies. And also what we found interesting in the comparative perspective was to investigate the different ideological roots. So that's usually in Italian, the slogan of the fascist was Dio, Patria e Famiglia, the God, the fatherland, and the family. And these type of values were all there, but they were more or less relevant in different combinations in different countries. So also there, the type of analysis that we developed on framing, strategic framing as well, is useful. I think, though, that in developing research on the radical right, I would, for instance, consider as relevant some elements that we have traditionally not addressed on the left. For instance, the sort of political economy of the far right, because it seems that on that side, a lot of money and a lot of investment have been quite relevant in mobilizing people. There are also, I think, some aspects that become relevant, especially nowadays, with this strange bedfellowship between radical right and Novax movement, conspirational movements, and so on. Also is something more particular to the right, the ways in which the sort of conspirational theories are used also bridged with the argument of the right. So I think addressing Michael's questions, I think it is true that we have done less on the right-wing movements and we have to do more now. So we have considered especially right-wing movements as counter movements. So in the interactions with progressive movements, we have to see them also in the interactions with institutions. My impression is also that given that on the right, these movements tend to be smaller, there are some more focus on specific interventions by some specific actors. For instance, Steve Bannon has been quite influential in many ways, is quite relevant. So I would say yes and no. We can use a lot of the social movement theories, but we should also expand a bit to consider things that on progressive social movements seems to be less relevant to study.
Thank you, Donatella. That's now the thing about the virtual roundtable. I always look at you, but I can only point to Anita if I really want to blink. But now we also have some questions in the Q&A online, and Sophia Hunger will read them to you. And then we also have to have an eye on time, because unfortunately Daniel has to leave us at 7:30 to also kind of move on then to another virtual event. As I said before, we're often late, but we also tend to have many meetings, one after another. So.
Yes, thank you. I will be the voice of the internet. And I will combine two questions that I think are connected to each other. So first question to everyone on the panel says that we have seen a rise in non-violent protest action, but it also appears that, or the data shows that the efficacy of these protests is decreasing. And is this because we live in an era of valuing individual identity over collective identity, so that we would rather have many messages than one message? And connected to this, so see it as a sub-question, there was a question about what about collective action and deep organizing? Is there an appetite for this in modern democracies, or are we in an era of short-term participation and protest? So I would say these are connected, and they're both to the whole panel.
Can I jump in? I also want to address Daniel's point, but it ties into the question from the internet. So one of the movements that I study, of course, is the climate strike. And like I said, I have a few papers on that. But I think that there's a difference between this grassroots movement, which I would say is not being led by a leader, by a political leader in particular. It arose as a grassroots movement in response to political opportunity structures, but also to the lack of action from political leaders. So I think those type of movements exist, and they're not easily explained by some leader, fanning the flames. In contrast, though, I do think that the protests around wearing masks, certainly in Canada, we see these led by political leaders, the populist leaders in Canada, while he doesn't have a seat in our parliament, he's been going around during our last election cycle, which was just a couple of weeks ago, and he is fanning the discontent and using his populist agenda to try to mobilize this group of masked people, anti-vaxxers and people who don't want to wear masks. So I do see those two different dynamics happening. And again, it may differ. And again, I don't know this, but in these particular examples, we see the right being mobilized by political leaders and the left more grassroots. But I don't know that that's a case, or maybe it's just my selective reading of what's going on. So I wanted to do that and also talk about the climate strike, because we did see an escalation of, this relatively peaceful strike where, youth were not going to school and protesting the lack of action on climate change, but we saw it escalate into Extinction Rebellion and more dramatic confrontational type of activities. And we could trace that evolution over time in terms of lack of response or effectiveness, I think, of, the regular Friday strikes. They just weren't being impactful in terms of getting leaders to respond. So our research suggests that that's in fact happening, but we also see something else happen over time with the climate strike, which is people were more likely to gravitate towards specific policies and say, over time, at first when it was just Greta or, maybe a few people in Europe who were engaging the climate strike, there may not have been some agreement about what the policy initiatives should be, but we see that over time on Twitter with these 3 million tweets that people are getting more precise in that. So yeah, that's a lot of different themes I'm trying to pick up with those examples. Thank you.
Who would like to follow Donatella? I see your finger.
Yes. Because I'm not so sure that the movements are not effective or less effective now than 10 years ago, to take a point of reference. Because I have the impression that we have many cases in which social movements have been quite successful in entering institutions and getting results. So, for instance, in terms of political parties, in Southern Europe, we have new political parties that emerged from movements and went directly from the streets into government. So it was a quite fast development. Of course, when they arrived in government, they were quite frustrated about what they could not do, and the activists even more so. But still, I think they make a difference. In electoral terms, we still have to study this, but there are many observers that think that the election of Biden has been also, and therefore the defeat of Trump had been facilitated by a movement like Black Lives Matter that has been also influential in other countries. And maybe also Olaf Scholz could, let's say, be grateful to some social movements who have promoted inside and outside the parties some type of transformation. So also in electoral terms, there is an efficacy. But if we look also at constitutional issues that are very important for the development of institutions in history, from Ireland to Chile, I think that social movements have been effective in producing changes in the legislations that political parties didn't dare or didn't want to produce. And I think that what we have to observe and recognize is that often social movements do not produce the effect that they would like, and they do not produce them as soon as they would like. But as I mentioned, I just came back today from Catalonia. There, the movement for independence didn't get independence, but I was talking with members of Catalanist associations, and they had membership that jumped from 1,500 to 250,000. So this means that as in the past, as in history, the effects can be quite mediated. Also, thinking about Shelley's research on climate change, there are a huge number of very young people. What we know from research on political socialization is that what they do when they are teenagers has an important impact on what they will do in the future. And so I think that also this type of biographical changes are ways through which also effects of social movements happen. So here as well, I think it depends from the different countries, different type of capacity to build coalitions also within the institutions. But I don't see movements as being uniformly inconsequential in these times.
Thank you very much, Donatella. I look at Daniel, because looking at the time, if you would like
So
to...
yeah, I'm sorry, I have to run. I'm chairing a panel at 1:30, and I think there's people waiting there. So, but let me just, maybe just two quick things. One, I mean, one thing that I've become more alert to in the study of voting behavior and in people responding to surveys is the degree to which there's a lot of expressive self-falsification going on. So, or I wonder to what degree, and it seems like there's some growing evidence that this is the case. So in other words, when 70% of Republicans say they think Joe Biden isn't really president, everybody freaks out about this. But I think, what it may turn out that there's a lot of people just saying this, they don't really believe it. And that there's some kind of expressive utility that comes with this. And it partly is because it's, responding to surveys is a low risk, low consequence kind of activity. And I wonder to what degree research has shown that there's a similar kind of phenomena taking place in the realm of social movements and protests, that people show up to protest. And I know there's all sorts of motivations for protests, collective solidarity and friendship and informal networks and so on. But, I think that the general view is probably overstates the significance of protest events or assumes a kind of ideological coherence to, let's say, an anti-vaccination protest that maybe we ought not to assume. And so I just wonder, that sort of seems like would be an interesting kind of area of research, is to thinking about the way in which this kind of expressive utility, analysts then overreact to it, and there's sort of everything spirals out of control. So that's just a final thought. And then the second point is just to thank you guys all so much for inviting me on this panel. I really enjoyed it and have learned a lot. And sorry to run off a little early. No, but thank you so much. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Bye. So Daniel leaves us with a little provocation, but I think one that also ties in nicely with what Shelley said about kind of maybe sometimes the core emotions we have kind of as public images and also in the field of study. We still have 15 minutes, and then I think at least we that were here for the whole time of this conference probably deserve a good drink, and hopefully you also have something at home. But we still have 15 minutes, and we also have some questions. I would like first the two questions in the room by Teresa Völker and Endre Borbat maybe to be asked, and then I also read you one in the chat, and then you can also pick and choose a bit where you want to go.
Thank you. So my question relates from a researcher's perspective. I mean, it's not a new question, but we just spoke about the new focus on right-wing extremism. And I was wondering, as researchers, how far should we go with our research questions, but also the data we generate and the questions we try to answer, because we could also become the target of these movements. So what are the political implications of our research when we don't interact with or do research on movements, so to say, on the good side of society or progressive movements, but the dark side?
Thank you, Teresa. And then please, Endre, if you would like.
Yes, thank you very much. My question is a bit related to, I think, what you all emphasized, but especially Donatella Della Porta, on this interaction between social movements and institutions and party politics. And I wanted to ask you something that I was also asked at the end of the panel in which we presented about what's new in this regard. If you think, for example, the Green parties that you mentioned, I think first in Germany they entered government in Hessen 30 years ago. The Social Democrats have been an institutional voice for trade unions for decades now. I was wondering, do you see as kind of a new phenomenon that we should study in this regard that kind of transcends this or defines maybe this historical period? And then a second kind of related question I was wondering is that oftentimes I feel like protest mobilizes young people in this episodic kind of engagement, but especially this constituency of people, of protests, are very skeptical towards institutional building, and they don't want to participate beyond kind of a demonstration or online activism and so on. I was just wondering if you see some ways how to channel that kind of political activism towards more institutional forms to kind of maybe achieve more durable change in societies. Thank you.
Perfect. I think very big and important question. So I would already leave it maybe with these questions. And who would like to first maybe respond to some of these points? The one on how far we can go, I think that's probably also one for Anita, maybe not just looking at the extreme like movements, but also kind of providing data on for the state on what they are actually doing.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I think this is one that state repression researchers ask themselves oftentimes, specifically if the state you're studying is the one that you live in or that you have family in. And so I think this is a question that we oftentimes ask ourselves, and I think that might be kind of a parallel to the kind of question you're asking. And I think the do no harm principle that we should probably all abide by in terms of our research also applies to ourselves. And so I think that should probably guide the limits to which you're comfortable kind of pushing that research. That said, I will say that in the last roughly decade of doing this work myself, I've realized that there has been a stronger politicization also for researchers studying countries that they do not live in. And specifically, I think that comes back to the question of transnational repression. So even if you're studying maybe the far-right movement within another country that you don't live in, it might have implications for you. And so I think being aware of that also within your training and with the extent to which you want your name attached to research, I think is an important point. So I'm aware of, for example, researchers in computer science who've done work on censorship, on internet control, that will publish the research under the name of one or two authors, but not all authors, to kind of protect the identity of certain people. And I think the more we kind of do this work in the contentious, to a certain extent, it shouldn't deter us, but we need to think about personal safety as well. I think maybe just coming to the point of the success of movements and maybe the usefulness of concepts that we mentioned earlier. I thought the intervention by Daniel was really interesting about the compatibility of studying protest movements and autocracies and democracies. And I think what Donatella said about solidarity between movements across borders in some ways provides an answer to that question, because we see that protest movements between autocracies and democracies are solidarizing themselves quite extensively because they're partly faced with the same methods. And so I think moving away from thinking about regimes and thinking towards tools that are used by regimes that might be authoritarian, even in democracies, can kind of help us use different concepts in different areas.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Maybe I would direct the question of what is new kind of in the relation between social movements and institutions to Donatella. I mean, that's also a big one, but maybe you could direct us also a bit where we should look for it in terms of the frontiers of our field.
Yes, no, I never claimed that it is something new, in the sense that also when I wrote this book on movement parties, I've learned a lot from the ways in which historians have been looking at the relationship between trade unions and parties of the Socialist Party families. The Greens are also another important examples of movements that have entered parliaments through political parties. I think what is relevant in this case is the sort of very fast pace through which these movements have entered not only parliaments, but also governments. So we had written this book on movement parties, taking the examples of Syriza, Podemos, and the Five Stars movement. And they are all parties that a few years after their foundations sit in government. And this also means that some types of processes that have been observed in the other families of movement parties, like institutionalizations, iron law of oligarchy, and so on, are also relevant for these parties nowadays. What I think would be interesting to observe as difference is the ways in which the use of new technologies is, if not allowed, but at least emphasized the attempt to keep connections with activists beyond party membership. So this attempt to broaden the scope of what scholars of political parties call party social linkages to going beyond party membership. And also another issue is that these political parties, I think, have been developing in very unstable political systems. So while the Green Party developed on a single issue and bringing that inside specific political type of political parties of parliament, in the case of these new parties, they've been acting within very radical transformations in the party system. And of course, they're also subject to much more potential volatility. Even if none of them disappears, to the contrary, they remain quite important parties, but like the other parties, they are also not able to rely upon stable constituencies, and so have to change very quickly the type of appeals, organizational structures, ways to try to keep connections with social movements, and I think this is also interesting to investigate. So I would say, answering Sven's questions of how to study them, I think it would be important really to bridge the ways in which party studies usually look at parties, so all the more structured sides, with an attention to the connections with societies that have been very important in research on the organizational structures of political parties, but then have been less relevant with the development of recent concerns more oriented to coalitions, party policies, and so on, and especially that had looked at parties as sort of economic actors, which I think they are not. So,
thank you, Donatella. And Shelley, I would of course love to now give you the floor and maybe also react to the sporadicness that Andrea had, but looking at the time, we also have 3 more questions. So if you don't mind, I would just kind of take the questions, and then you all 3 also have kind of the chance to pick and choose again where you would like to put the emphasis, if that's okay for you, Shelley.
Yes. So I'll do a quick response. One of the things that I think is new is asking the question, not how the activists interact with political parties in their own countries, but how these activists interact with political leaders in other countries. And so I'm thinking of the example of Greta and her interactions on Twitter with Donald Trump. So that is certainly something new that we didn't see before. Of course, we didn't have the infrastructure to engage in these campaigns to try to influence leaders in other countries. And then also tying into Forrest raised a question in the Q&As about the effectiveness of digital demonstrations, which of course is again another topic very dear to my heart. But one of the things we saw with the climate strike, they engaged in a big day of online campaigning in April of 2021, but I'm not sure about the timelines of why they would do it then, because a lot of the attention from the climate movement has been towards Donald Trump. And so I wonder why they didn't time the movement, the digital demonstration, to do more damage to him in the electoral context. Anyways, these are things that I'm thinking about as sort of new things in relation to the study of social movements.
Perfect. Many thanks for keeping it brief. And now I have Dieter Rucht here in the room, and I would read out 2 more questions, and then we kind of come to a final concluding round. But I mean, this was also a bit a brainstorming exercise, so I think we probably stay a bit in this wilderness of thoughts also till the end. But I would then also ask you to maybe just make a final remark, kind of where we could be heading. But please, Dieter.
Looking at the title of the roundtable, Frontiers in Social Movement Research, I'm asking the panelists, what are the territories that should be explored? Not your personal preferences, but taking a broader look at the field. What should be studied in the future? What are urgent research questions?
Perfect. That's kind of the big one again, but you have to say it kind of very sharp and concise. Just Katrin Herms has probably also one of these ideas for future research, because she said, which concepts you suggest to study new conspiracy movements? And would you agree that certain activists may be more understood as religious communities rather than political actors? And Ruben below had rather also a bit the normative question on that we're now studying right-wing movements and left-wing movements, and that in the field of movement studies, he thinks research publicly supporting, protesting with, against particular movements, that he thinks this happens more than when it comes to support for political parties in classical political science. And he was just wondering if you agree with this observation, and what do you think about kind of the public support for the objects of study or outright rejection of our objects of study. So big questions, short answers, that's kind of... Shelley, would you like to go first, maybe?
Okay, I will talk fast.
Exactly, you can be short.
I'm interested in their answers. That's why I didn't want to speak up unless I had to. Okay, so the study, though, of religious movements and conspiracy theorists, I mean, I don't know that that's particularly new, because if we think back to David Snow's early work, and he did do that transitioning of religious movements and social movements. So, you know, that's an angle to kind of pick up rather than maybe something that's new. I don't know if it is the best approach to studying these conspiracy theorist movements or whatever you conceptualize them. But in terms of my own area, my interests are in this transnational dimensions, the idea of movements trying to influence leaders in other countries, and then the potential of that to spread democratization. Of course, I'm also interested in misinformation. So that came up in some of the other dimensions, and whether or not people are mobilized by misinformation, which I think is something we need to talk about in what we're working with. And of course, the use of digital media, there's plenty of questions to be asked and answered around the role of digital media and social movements. That's it.
Anita, would you like to go?
Well, I'll say 2 things, or 2 areas where I think we require, or where we should be heading in terms of research. I'm going to not claim that this covers all of the research we've talked about, because I'm not an expert on many of the things mentioned here. I think two areas. The first is pro-government protests. I think we do not know enough about pro-government protests, specifically mobilization, online mobilization, and the way in which this affects larger social movements. And then the second one, and this is kind of going back to what I said before, the use of forecasting and data analytics by state actors, maybe also by non-state actors, to understand protest or future protests and how that affects societal dynamics. So I personally am worried about the research we're currently doing as researchers in trying to predict the next social movement and how that might be abused, in short.
Thank you. Now, Donatella, if you would like to.
Yes, in 1 minute, I think it's just a bit of a slogan, but I will discuss it with Dieter soon, strolling in Grunewald. And I think that's our territory, for me, should be the analysis of social movements in eventful times. So we have pointed a lot in the past on the need to consider social movements as actors in a normal political system. But I think these are very unsettled times, times that are characterized by very fast changes and intertwined crises. And in this, I think also the borders between different type of concepts, literature, and so on tend to blur. And in particular, I think that we should look at the ways in which social movements use the type of instability of many structures and many institutions in order to penetrate them, and the way in which also social movements, organizations, social movement activists tend to enter different fields from, as I said, mutualist type of activities to economic type of activities to various forms of food sovereignty and so on. And I think that we will have a lot of research to do in the next years.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And I think that that's exactly the right word to close this. There is a lot of for us to research and of course also be very innovative in the methodologies and kind of the strategies we use for that. So thanks a lot for sharing your insights and food for our thoughts kind of for the next years to come. And hopefully we will see each other all again here in Berlin one day, and also to have a glass of wine also with all the participants remotely out there. For sure, those that are in the room and were with us now for these 2 days deserve that. We will go now to the canteen of the WZP, those of you who know that, and we'll have a little aperitivo there. But thanks again, especially for Shelley, to Shelley, Donatella, and Anita for having been with us. And you all have a nice evening or afternoon or whatever time it might be at your place. Bye.
Thank you all. And thank you, Sven.
Yeah, thank you.